I'm Jay Misquick, Director and Translation Editor of Aliform Publishing. In honor of Women's History Month, we'd like to share with you some of the great novels that we've had the honor of publishing by Latin American women authors, as well as taking a look at some of the cover art that Latin American women visual artists have given us for our publications. One of the first books we ever published at Aliform was by Mexican writer Beatriz Escalante, called Magdalena, A Fable of Immortality, which is, in brief, a story about a young alchemist, young woman in medieval Europe who is searching for the alchemist stone, which is the secret to eternal life. And if there is a moral to the story, I guess it's you better watch what you ask for, because you might just get it. This has a wonderful cover, not by a Latin American women artist, but by the French painter Georges de la Tour, called The Penitent Magdalene, in which Mary Magdalene is looking into a mirror. What really attracted me about that image was that a very key point in this novel, Magdalena, the alchemist, looks into a mirror and sees a reflection of herself in the future. And I thought that was a very apropos connection between the text and the image. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York was kind enough to grant us permission to use this on our cover. Another Mexican writer that we've had the pleasure of working with is Ana Clavel. And in fact, one of our next publications at the end of this year or early 2022 is going to be a translation of her novel Breve Tratado del Corazón, a brief treatise on the heart. We've already published a couple of her works. One of them, the first of those, Desire in its Shadow, which is a translation of Los Deseos de su Sombra by the publisher Alfaguara. And if I could just make a little aside for those of you who look for interesting writing in Spanish, the publisher Alfaguara, I don't think I've ever read a book by them that hasn't been spectacular. This is an interesting story. Ana often deals with identity and perception, and the very first image, the opening of that story, is a young woman who suddenly awakes to find herself in the middle of traffic in downtown Mexico City. And not only that, she looks down to find herself invisible. And it's a great metaphor, I think, of Anna's questioning of identity. It's also a wonderful tour of downtown Mexico City, great architectural descriptions of noteworthy buildings and old streets and cantinas. A wonderful view of downtown Mexico City. We have also published by Ana a story called Shipwreck Body, Cuerpo Náufrago. The cover here has a series of urinals on it, and I won't go into detail why, other than to say that it's a key metaphor in understanding that story. When you come to understand what that urinal means, it kind of unlocks the hidden meaning, so to speak, behind that text. Anna, when we first got in contact with her, she called us, and as I was speaking to her on the phone, she told me that we had already published her, and I said, well, we've got a relatively modest catalog. I think I would recall if you were in it or not. And she said, well, look at your book you've published, Mariana, and on the cover, that's me, the woman who's looking out the window. And while most of our work is by Latin American women artists and writers, this is a text by an American writer, Catherine Vaz, about a Portuguese nun in the 17th century at the time of revolution and political upheaval, who has an impossible love with a French mercenary. A rather extraordinary story based upon real events and a real person. And indeed, The model here, looking out the window at us, is Ana Clavel. This painting is by Mexican painter Marco Tulio Lamoy a number of years ago, and I had been doing some modeling modeled in this image for Lamoy, and sure enough, before we ever put her into print, she was already there with us. Another writer that we've had the pleasure of publishing is Maria Rosa Lojo from Argentina. This novel, Passionate Nomads, is also kind of a magical story about a modern day Merlin the magician who goes into the pampas of Argentina in search of a mythical lost indigenous tribe. And the further into the pampas they travel, the deeper back in time they go. And Lojo really brings together here a kind of a remarkable connection between history and landscape, and what we have lost through history and what we have somehow managed to hold on to. This cover is by Mexican sculptor and installation artist Lourdes Quay. It's called Drawing on Nature, and this is an ephemeral. This was an ephemeral work of art. That is, it was a temporary piece. It was made to disappear of its own volition, and it is a ring of woven branches and twigs that was probably about 8 feet across, and it was placed into a pond where it was photographed, and eventually slowly sunk into the waters to kind of rejoin the earth. Ephemeral, to be ephemeral is an interesting idea in art, to think that sculptures and paintings are made to last, but then something that is made to deliberately disappear is a very interesting idea. The photographer who took this cover image is named Petronella Eitzma, and we have also published a text of her photography called Legacy. Nell is an outstanding photographer who took several trips to Vietnam to document the effects of Agent Orange a generation or two later. And I don't want to do a disservice to the images in this text by kind of showing them up here on the screen like this, but they are incredibly moving and incredibly dignified representations of these people who have been impacted so deeply, who carry a legacy that very much was foisted upon them with no volition of their own. A couple other pieces here, texts we have here by, with some cover art, again by Lourdes Quay. This is a book, a text that is called Master of the Sea by the Brazilian novelist José Sarney. This particular cover image was made out of a huge paper boat. If you remember as a child, you might have taken a sheet of notebook paper like this and folded it, and suddenly, whoom, you have a little boat there that you can float on the water or float down the gutter during the rains. Quay made her own sheet of paper, the same dimensions as a piece of paper, except about 11 feet by 8 feet instead of inches. Eventually folded this up into a huge boat that she placed upon a wave of sand and filmed with more floating images behind it. A very apropos image for this novel, which is about a fisherman who beloved is washed away one day by the sea monsters, by the immensity of the sea, and he spends
his life searching after her, sailing from place to place. That image of the boat, just real briefly, one more image by Lourdes Quay is the cover art for The Triumphant Voyage by Colombian writer Eduardo Garcia Aguilar. This is an interesting image. This novel is about the voyages also around the world of a young poet at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. This cover art is from an installation that Quay did at Franconia Sculpture Park in Minnesota a number of years ago called Erratic Vessels. And erratics are big rocks, if you've ever seen in the middle of a farm field, a rock sitting there out of nowhere, that's called an erratic. And those were brought here brought to that location thousands upon thousands of years ago, carried by the glaciers. And here we have these boats carved of granite that are also part of the immensity of history that helped carry this character forward within the story. Another young Mexican visual artist that we have worked with is Edith Garcia, who did the cover art for the very first book that Aliform ever published called Mexico Madness, Manifesto for a Disenchanted Generation, which also happens to be by the same writer who did The Triumphant Voyage. We've done a number of books by Eduardo. Besides being a novelist, he's a journalist. He's a correspondent for Agence France Presse. Currently lives in Paris, but as a Colombian writer, he lives so much of his life in Mexico that he's actually included in El Diccionario de Escritores Mexicanos, the dictionary of Mexican writers. And this book is really one of the first books, I think, in the United States that deeply went into the Zapatistas. Back in the day, in the 90s and at the turn of the millennium, the Zapatista movement in Mexico was an incredible social force. And this book is about about a 2-week span where the journalist goes into Chiapas to cover the Zapatistas and what they represent. I think Edith Garcia captivates very well in this image, kind of the violence and the dismembering of humanity that the Zapatistas were fighting against. She's gone on to become a ceramicist. This is one of Edith's very earliest, or I shouldn't say earliest, but early in her professional career when she was still doing graphic art. She's now living in London doing ceramics and is a wonderful visual artist in a different realm, or in a different medium now. One last text I'd like to mention that we had the pleasure of getting some interesting visuals for is Die Lady Die. If you have seen any Almodovar movies, if Almodovar wrote a novel, this would be it. It's a hilarious story about a young woman in Buenos Aires, from the suburbs of Buenos Aires, who decides she's going to marry Ricky Martin and have his baby. And Ricky shows up to Buenos Aires one weekend to give a concert, and this is the story where she creates a path of destruction through the city in order to try to achieve her goals. The cover art for this is by an Argentine-Canadian painter and visual artist, Patricia Badani, now professor of visual arts at the University of Illinois. And this also is a work from very, very early in her career. Pat's gone on to really explore digital art and the impact of technology in the arts, and archival information as an artistic medium. And this is something kind of atypical of our work, and we're actually fortunate enough to have here in our offices at Aliform, at Earthquake Arts, the original painting that the cover comes from. And so it's funny to see it reduced in size. It's a very impactful work that again is not so typical of this artist's work, but is maybe even all the more interesting for being so different. Folks, we've had the pleasure of working with a number of Latin American women writers and visual artists over the years, and we're honored to have done so. Please consider that artists are essential workers now more than any time, especially when we've had so much isolation from each other over this past year. Artists bring us the world, they present it to us, they show us the world like a mirror so we can look into it and examine ourselves. Thanks for sharing this time with me. Nos vemos.